It's beyond repair, the shop owner said with a laugh that echoed across the garage. And honestly, lady, so are your expectations. The words landed harder than the cold November rain tapping against the high glass windows of Dalton Restoration Auto. Claire Whitmore stood perfectly still beside the dust-covered 1967 Shelby Mustang, her fingers tightening around the leather strap of her purse while a circle of mechanics and wealthy collectors watched the humiliation unfold like entertainment. The fluorescent lights above buzzed softly, reflecting off chrome toolboxes and polished concrete floors. But the old Mustang looked forgotten beneath years of silence. Its faded midnight blue paint hidden beneath scratches and rust like a memory nobody wanted anymore. Rick Dalton wiped his hands on a rag and shook his head dramatically. Engine's dead. Frames warped. Transmissions shot. You'd spend more rebuilding this thing than buying 3 brand new Ferraris. A few men near the espresso counter chuckled under their breath. Claire swallowed carefully. I didn't bring it here to replace it, she said quietly. I brought it here because it mattered to my father. Rick smirked. Sentimental value doesn't make metal run. Somewhere in the back of the garage, a mop bucket rolled softly across the floor. Nobody noticed the man pushing it at first. Ethan Hayes moved slowly between the work bays, sleeves rolled up, worn denim shirt stained with grease and years of labor. He looked like the kind of man people stopped seeing after 5 seconds. Mid-40s. Tired eyes. Work boots that had survived too many winters. The kind of man wealthy people accidentally talked over. But when he passed the Mustang, he stopped. Completely. His eyes lingered on the cracked steering wheel, the original Cobra emblem, the slight bend near the front quarter panel. Then he looked at Claire. Not at her tailored coat or expensive watch. At the sadness sitting quietly behind her eyes. Rick noticed him standing there and laughed. What's wrong, Hayes? You planning to pray over it? More laughter rippled through the room. Ethan didn't react. He simply rested one rough hand along the Mustang's hood. And for a moment the garage became strangely still. Rain tapped harder against the windows. Somewhere overhead, an old heater rattled alive. Claire watched him carefully now. There was something different about the way he touched the car. Not like a mechanic inspecting damage. More like someone greeting an old friend after years apart. Ethan crouched slowly near the front tire, studying the suspension in silence. Rick threw his rag onto the workbench. Don't waste your time, he snapped. That thing belongs in a junkyard. Ethan finally looked up. His voice was calm enough to disappear if the room hadn't suddenly gone quiet. Funny thing about old machines, he said softly. Most people give up on them before they actually listen. Nobody spoke. Even the espresso machine hissed into silence. Claire frowned slightly. You think it can be fixed? Rick barked a laugh before Ethan could answer. Lady, he mops floors. But Ethan never looked at Rick. His eyes stayed on the Mustang. Then, almost like he was speaking to the car itself, he said, Mind if I take a look before you bury it? The laughter faded slowly, but the tension stayed hanging in the garage like exhaust trapped beneath steel rafters. Rick Dalton folded his arms across his chest and leaned against the workbench with the confidence of a man who had spent years being the loudest voice in every room. Fine, he said with a mocking grin. Take your miracle shot, Hayes. Everybody could use a little comedy tonight. A few mechanics smirked again, though quieter this time. Claire Whitmore remained beside the Mustang without moving, her eyes fixed on Ethan as he slowly opened the driver's side door. The old hinges groaned softly, releasing the faint scent of worn leather, dust, and gasoline trapped inside memories older than some people in the room. Ethan slid into the seat carefully, almost respectfully, his rough fingers brushing along the cracked steering wheel. The fluorescent lights reflected across the faded dashboard, while rainwater streaked down the tall windows behind him. For several seconds he said nothing at all. Then his hand paused near the ignition. Claire noticed the smallest change in his expression. Pain. Not dramatic pain. Quiet pain. The kind people carried for years without speaking about it. Ethan stepped back out slowly and crouched near the front bumper again. Has it been sitting long? He asked. Claire nodded. Almost 8 years. Rick whistled sarcastically. That explains the smell of death. Ethan ignored him completely. Who maintained it before? Claire hesitated. My father did. Himself. Ethan gave the smallest nod, as if that answer mattered more than anything else. Somewhere in the corner of the garage, an old radio played soft country music beneath the hum of fluorescent lights. One mechanic rolled a toolbox past them while another whispered something under his breath, but Ethan stayed locked on the Mustang like the rest of the world had disappeared. Claire studied him more carefully now. Up close, he did not look weak the way she first assumed. Tired, yes. Worn down by life, maybe. But there was steadiness in him. The kind built slowly through disappointment instead of success. You really think you can fix it? She asked quietly. Ethan stood and wiped his hands on a faded rag tucked into his back pocket. I think people quit too early, he answered. Rick laughed again. You hear that? Philosopher janitor strikes again. But Claire did not laugh this time. Ethan walked toward a rusted red toolbox near the corner workbench. Unlike the polished chrome cabinets around the garage, his tools looked old, carefully preserved instead of replaced. Every wrench sat perfectly organized. Every socket carried years of use polished into the metal by repetition and patience. One of the younger mechanics muttered, "Guy treats those tools like museum pieces." Ethan heard him, but said nothing. He simply picked up a flashlight and returned to the Mustang. Claire watched him kneel beside the engine bay while rain tapped steadily overhead. Then something unexpected happened. Ethan smiled faintly. Not at her. Not at Rick. At the engine itself. Like he recognized something nobody else could see. What? Claire asked softly. Ethan aimed the flashlight deeper beneath the hood. Your father loved this car, he said. Claire blinked in surprise. How? Could you possibly know that? Ethan tightened his jaw slightly, eyes still fixed on the engine. Because nobody keeps bolts this clean unless they care about every inch of what they are holding onto. The room grew quieter again. Even Rick stopped talking for a moment. Ethan reached carefully beneath the engine bay, touched one loose wire, and then looked up at Claire with calm eyes that suddenly carried something sharper than before. This car is not dead, he said softly. Somebody just stopped listening to it. The garage stayed quiet long after Ethan spoke, as if the old Mustang itself had pulled the sound out of the room. Claire Whitmore slowly stepped closer to the open hood while the overhead lights flickered faintly against the rain-dark windows. Rick Dalton rolled his eyes and grabbed a paper coffee cup from the counter. You cannot seriously be buying this, he muttered. The engine block is frozen solid. Half the wiring is corroded. That car has been dead longer than some marriages. Ethan continued studying the engine without reacting. He adjusted the flashlight between his shoulder and neck, then carefully loosened a panel beneath the steering column. His movements were slow, practiced, patient, not flashy, not performative. The kind of movements that came from years of learning how not to force broken things. Claire noticed every mechanic in the garage watching him now, though nobody wanted to admit it. Even the men who laughed earlier had stopped smiling. Ethan reached into the compartment beneath the dashboard and paused. His fingers brushed against something hidden deep inside. He looked up at Claire. Did your father leave anything in the car? Claire blinked softly. I do not know. Ethan carefully pulled out a small cassette tape wrapped in faded cloth. Dust drifted through the beam of his flashlight as he turned it over in his hand. Written across the label in blue ink were the words, for Claire. The entire garage went still. Claire stared at the tape like the air had suddenly vanished from the room. No, she whispered under her breath. That cannot be. Ethan handed it to her gently. She took it with shaking fingers, her eyes fixed on her. Father's handwriting. For several seconds, she said nothing at all. Outside, thunder rolled low across the Oregon sky, while rain streaked down the tall garage windows in silver lines. Rick cleared his throat awkwardly. Probably old music or something. But Claire shook her head slowly. My father used to record messages when he traveled. Her voice cracked slightly before she steadied it again. After he got sick, he stopped finishing most of them. Ethan looked back toward the Mustang quietly. Then maybe this one matters. Claire swallowed hard and nodded once, though emotion pressed visibly behind her composed expression. She turned the cassette over in her hand carefully, like something fragile enough to break if held too tightly. The tape player stopped working years ago, she admitted softly. Ethan leaned farther beneath the dashboard again. Not because it failed. Rick scoffed immediately. Here we go. Ethan pointed his flashlight toward a disconnected wire tucked carefully behind the audio unit. Somebody unplugged it. Rick frowned. What are you implying? Ethan sat back slowly on the rolling mechanic stool and looked around the garage for the first time all night. His calm expression never changed, but something in his eyes sharpened. I am saying this car has been misdiagnosed more than once. The younger mechanics exchanged nervous glances. Claire looked between Rick and Ethan carefully now. You think someone intentionally overlooked the problems? Rick slammed his coffee cup onto the counter. That is ridiculous. But Ethan simply reached beneath the dashboard again and reconnected the wire with one quiet click. Suddenly, the old cassette deck flickered weakly to life. Static crackled softly through the speakers. Claire covered her mouth instantly. The sound was broken and faint, but alive. Rick's face tightened. Ethan rested both hands on the steering wheel and stared quietly through the rain-covered windshield. Machines remember how they were treated, he said softly. So do people. The weak glow from the cassette deck faded in and out beneath the dashboard, while nobody inside the garage seemed willing to breathe too loudly anymore. Claire Whitmore still held the old tape in both hands, staring at it like she was afraid the moment would disappear if she blinked. Ethan Hayes sat quietly behind the wheel of the Mustang, one arm resting lightly near the cracked steering column while rain rolled down the windows behind him in silver streaks. Rick Dalton finally broke the silence with a sharp laugh that sounded more forced than confident this time. Congratulations, he said loudly. The janitor plugged in a loose wire. Somebody get him a trophy. A few mechanics chuckled uncertainly, though the sound died quickly. Ethan stepped out of the car without responding. He moved toward the open hood again, flashlight tucked beneath his arm, while he studied the engine bay with patient concentration. Claire followed him slowly now, ignoring Rick completely. Can the tape play? She asked quietly. Ethan glanced toward the old cassette deck. Maybe. Rick threw his hands up dramatically. Maybe? That is your expert opinion. He walked closer, lowering his voice enough for everyone to hear it anyway. Lady, this guy pushes a mop for $8 an hour. You are standing here treating him like some miracle worker because he found an old tape and plugged in a loose wire. Ethan tightened a bolt slowly without looking up. $10.50, he said calmly. Rick frowned. What? Minimum wage went up. One mechanic accidentally laughed before quickly covering it with a cough. Claire lowered her eyes briefly, hiding the faintest hint of a smile. Rick's face darkened. You think this is funny? Ethan finally stood upright again, wiping grease from his hands with the faded rag in his back pocket. No, he answered softly. I think embarrassing people usually says more about the crowd than the person standing alone. The garage fell silent again. Rick stepped closer, his boots echoing across the polished floor. You got something to prove, Hayes? Ethan shook his head once. Not anymore. That answer landed strangely hard in the room. Claire noticed it immediately. There was no anger in Ethan's voice. No ego. Just exhaustion mixed with something deeper. The kind of quiet that came from surviving disappointment too many times to count. Rick smirked again, but it looked thinner now. Fine. Let us make this interesting. He pointed toward the Mustang. You think you can bring this thing back to life? Do it right here, in front of everybody. One of the younger mechanics immediately pulled out his phone. Another leaned against a toolbox waiting for the show. Claire looked uncomfortable suddenly. Rick, maybe this is not necessary. Oh, come on, Rick interrupted. He wants respect? Let him earn it. Ethan stared at the engine silently for several seconds while rain rattled harder against the roof overhead. The old country song on the radio faded into static. Somewhere in the office, a coffee machine hissed softly into the quiet. Then Ethan removed his work gloves slowly and placed them on the hood of the Mustang with careful precision. Claire noticed his hands immediately. Scarred knuckles. Oil stains buried deep into the skin. Hands that looked older than the rest of him. You do not have to do this, she said softly. Ethan looked toward her for the first time in several minutes. His tired eyes carried surprising gentleness beneath the fluorescent lights. Your father kept this car alive because it meant something, he said quietly. That deserves better than becoming a punchline. Then he reached for a wrench, leaned beneath the hood, and the entire garage leaned closer with him. The sound of rain deepened outside as Ethan Hayes leaned farther beneath the Mustang's hood, the beam from his flashlight cutting across layers of dust, rust, and forgotten years. Nobody in the garage seemed interested in leaving anymore. Mechanics who should have gone home an hour earlier now stood shoulder to shoulder near the tool cabinets, watching quietly while Rick Dalton paced nearby with growing irritation. Claire Whitmore stayed beside the front bumper, arms folded tightly against the cold that had settled into the building after sunset. Ethan worked without hurry. That was the strange thing. He did not move like someone trying to impress anybody. Every adjustment looked measured, intentional, like he trusted patience more than speed. The old radio crackled softly in the background while he disconnected a corroded wire near the ignition coil. Fuel lines clogged. He murmured mostly to himself. Battery still has enough life to talk. Rick scoffed loudly. Talk. It is a car, not your therapist. A couple mechanics laughed automatically, but Ethan kept working. Claire noticed something else now. Every time Rick mocked him, Ethan somehow became calmer instead of defensive. It unsettled the room more than anger would have. Ethan wiped his hands and slowly reached inside the driver's side window. Try this, he said quietly. Claire blinked. Me? Ethan nodded once. Turn the key halfway. Do not force it. Rick rolled his eyes dramatically and checked his watch. This should be good. Claire slid carefully into the old leather seat, still holding the cassette tape in one hand. The inside of the Mustang smelled faintly of gasoline, dust, and old summers trapped in fabric. Her fingers trembled slightly as she placed the key into the ignition. Ethan rested one hand lightly against the roof beside the open window. Halfway, he repeated calmly. Claire turned the key. Click. Nothing else. Rick smirked immediately. Amazing progress. Ethan ignored him. He listened instead, completely still. The garage quieted with him. Rain tapped softly against the metal roof overhead. Somewhere near the office, a soda machine hummed beneath the fluorescent lights. Ethan leaned closer toward the engine. Then he smiled faintly again. There you are, he whispered under his breath. Rick frowned. What is that supposed to mean? Ethan reached down quickly, tightening something beneath the carburetor with a small wrench. Try again. Claire inhaled slowly and turned the key once more. At first there was only static silence. Then suddenly a deep, rough vibration rolled through the Mustang like a sleeping animal shifting beneath blankets. The engine coughed once, twice. A mechanic near the wall lowered his phone in shock. Another straightened away from the toolbox. Claire froze completely behind the wheel. Rick's smirk disappeared. Ethan adjusted the choke gently with one grease-stained hand. Again, he said softly. Claire turned the key a third time. This time the old Shelby roared awake. Not perfectly, not smoothly, but alive. The sound thundered through the garage with raw, uneven power, rattling tool drawers and shaking years of dust loose from the rafters overhead. Nobody moved. Nobody laughed. The vibration rolled through the concrete floor while steam rose faintly from beneath the hood. Claire covered her mouth instantly, tears filling her eyes before she could stop them. Ethan stepped back from the car slowly, breathing hard now for the first time all night. Rick stared at the running engine like reality itself had betrayed him. One mechanic whispered under his breath, "No way." Ethan looked toward Claire quietly while the Mustang continued rumbling through the garage like a heartbeat returning after years of silence. Sometimes, he said softly, things just need someone willing to listen longer than everybody else. The Mustang continued rumbling unevenly beneath the fluorescent lights while nobody inside the garage seemed to remember how to speak. Steam drifted softly upward from the engine bay, curling through the cold air as if the old car itself had just taken its first breath in years. Claire Whitmore sat frozen behind the wheel, tears shining in her eyes while her fingers rested against the cracked leather steering wheel her father once held. Ethan Hayes stepped back slowly from the hood, breathing quietly through exhaustion. Grease streaked across his hands and sleeves. Rick Dalton stared at the running engine with a stiff expression that no longer looked confident. It is temporary, he muttered finally. A lucky spark does not mean the car is saved. Ethan closed the hood gently instead of slamming it. No, he said calmly. But it means somebody gave up too soon. One of the younger mechanics lowered his phone and shook his head. How did you even know where to start? Ethan wiped his hands with the same faded rag and shrugged lightly. The car tells you. Rick scoffed again, but weaker now. Cars do not talk. Ethan glanced toward the Mustang. Neither do most people. That does not mean they have nothing to say. Claire looked at him differently after that. Not like a janitor. Not like a mechanic. Like a man, carrying something heavier than everybody else in the room. The garage slowly began emptying as rain softened outside into a quiet mist. A few customers whispered near the office windows before leaving. The younger mechanics avoided eye contact with Ethan now, almost embarrassed by how quickly they laughed earlier. Rick disappeared into his office without another word. slamming the glass door harder than necessary. Claire remained beside the Mustang while Ethan carefully organized his tools back into the old red toolbox. Every wrench returned to the exact place it belonged. "You did not have to stay," she said softly. Ethan kept working quietly. "Neither did you." Claire smiled faintly for the first time that night. "I suppose that is true." Silence settled comfortably between them while the engine ticked softly as it cooled. Somewhere outside, tires hissed across wet pavement. Ethan finally closed the toolbox and reached for his worn jacket hanging beside the workbench. As he lifted it, a folded newspaper clipping slipped quietly onto the floor. Claire bent automatically to pick it up before he could stop her. Her eyes dropped to the faded headline. National Restoration Institute honors Ethan Hayes for historic aviation rebuild. Claire blinked in surprise. The article showed a younger Ethan standing beside a restored World War II aircraft inside a museum hangar, wearing a pressed white shirt instead of stained work clothes. Another line caught her attention immediately. Widely considered one of the most gifted restoration engineers in the country. Claire slowly looked up at him. "You never told anyone who you were." Ethan took the clipping gently from her hand. His expression tightened almost invisibly. "That was a long time ago." Claire studied him carefully beneath the buzzing fluorescent lights. "You rebuilt military aircraft?" Ethan folded the article once and slipped it back into his jacket pocket. "Among other things." "Then why are you working here?" For the first time all evening, Ethan hesitated before answering. His eyes drifted toward the rain-covered windows instead of hers. "Because sometimes starting over quietly hurts less than failing loudly." Claire felt something shift inside her hearing that. Not pity. Respect. Deep, quiet respect. Ethan picked up the toolbox and headed toward the side exit near the service bay. Before opening the door, he paused briefly without turning around. "Do not play the cassette yet," he said softly. Claire frowned slightly. "Why?" Ethan rested one tired hand against the cold metal door. "Because your father probably wanted you to hear it in a car that felt alive again." Then he stepped out into the rainy Oregon night, leaving Claire standing alone beside the softly ticking Mustang and wondering how many people she had overlooked simply because they wore the wrong uniform. The next morning the rain had stopped, but the air outside Dalton Restoration Auto still carried the cold smell of wet pavement and gasoline. Pale sunlight pushed through heavy Oregon clouds while mechanics rolled open the service bay doors one by one. Inside the garage, the Mustang sat beneath bright overhead lights cleaner than before, its midnight blue paint slowly beginning to breathe beneath years of dust. Claire Whitmore arrived early carrying 2 cups of coffee and the cassette tape carefully tucked inside her coat pocket. She expected silence when she walked in. Instead, she found Ethan Hayes already there. Alone. The old radio hummed softly beside him while he worked beneath the hood with steady concentration, sleeves rolled above his forearms, grease streaked lightly across his hands again. Steam curled from the coffee cup resting beside the toolbox. Claire paused near the doorway, watching him for a moment before speaking. "You came in before sunrise?" Ethan glanced up briefly. "Old habits." He tightened one final bolt and lowered himself from the engine bay. Claire handed him the second coffee. "Black?" she asked softly. Ethan looked mildly surprised. "Lucky guess. You seem like someone who stopped expecting sugar from life a long time ago." A faint smile touched the corner of Ethan's mouth before disappearing again. "That is probably fair." The Mustang rested quietly between them while sunlight reflected softly across the chrome trim. For the first time in years, Claire could almost imagine her father standing beside the car again, laughing with grease on his hands the way he used to every summer. Then the sound of expensive tires crunching outside broke the calm. 3 luxury SUVs pulled into the parking lot. Rick Dalton stepped out of the first vehicle wearing a sharp gray coat instead of mechanic coveralls, followed by several investors and collectors carrying tablets and coffee cups. Claire frowned immediately. "What is this?" Rick flashed a polished smile that looked rehearsed. "Private showcase. Big clients. I moved it up after last night's little miracle." Ethan quietly set his coffee aside. The investors stepped into the garage admiring the rows of restored classic cars, while Rick guided them toward the Mustang like a salesman unveiling a prize horse. "This beauty was nearly unsalvageable," Rick announced loudly. "But thanks to Dalton Restoration, we brought it back from the dead." Claire's expression hardened. "Excuse me." Rick ignored her completely. One investor crouched beside the Mustang with clear admiration. Beautiful machine. Another nodded toward Ethan standing nearby. He work here. Rick smirked lightly. Maintenance staff. Ethan said nothing. He simply watched quietly while Rick accepted praise that did not belong to him. Claire looked between them in disbelief. You are really doing this, she whispered. Rick lowered his voice sharply. Do not embarrass me in front of clients. Ethan stepped back toward his toolbox calmly, but Claire noticed something different this time. Not anger. Disappointment. The kind that came from being invisible for too long. Rick clapped his hands together dramatically. Let us hear her run. One of the investors smiled. Please. Claire looked immediately toward Ethan. He hesitated only slightly before nodding once. Go ahead. Claire slid into the driver's seat while the investors gathered closer, phones already out recording. The cassette tape rested safely inside her coat pocket while her fingers turned the ignition key slowly. Click. Silence. Her stomach tightened instantly. She tried again. Nothing. The garage atmosphere shifted immediately. Rick's confident smile returned too quickly. Well, he said with fake sympathy, looks like yesterday's spark was temporary after all. Claire stared at the dead dashboard in confusion while whispers spread quietly among the investors. Ethan's eyes narrowed toward the engine bay. For the first time since Claire met him, his expression changed completely. Not embarrassed. Not uncertain. Sharp. Focused. Like a man who suddenly realized someone had touched something they never should have touched. The silence inside Dalton Restoration Auto turned heavy enough to feel in the chest. Claire Whitmore sat frozen behind the wheel of the Mustang, while the dead dashboard reflected pale morning light across her face. Around her, the investors shifted awkwardly, whispering beneath their breath while Rick Dalton spread his hands with practiced disappointment. That, he said loudly, is why professionals do not gamble on fantasies. Ethan Hayes did not answer immediately. He walked slowly toward the front of the Mustang instead, eyes locked beneath the hood with the focus of someone listening to a conversation nobody else could hear. Claire stepped out of the car carefully. Ethan, his expression stayed calm, but sharper now than she had ever seen it. He lifted the hood in one smooth motion and studied the engine bay silently. The younger mechanics gathered closer again while the investors exchanged uncertain looks. Rick crossed his arms. You already had your moment yesterday. Ethan reached toward the fuel line and stopped. His fingers touched a fresh cut near the clamp. Tiny, precise, deliberate. Claire saw his jaw tighten slightly. What is it? She asked softly. Ethan did not look up. Somebody loosened the line. The garage went quiet again. Rick laughed immediately, but too fast. Oh, please. Now we are inventing sabotage because your miracle died. Ethan finally turned toward him. Not angry. Not loud. Somehow that made the room even more uncomfortable. Machines break naturally, he said softly. This did not. One investor stepped closer. Can you fix it? Ethan glanced toward Claire instead of answering him. Her eyes held disappointment now, but not toward the car. Toward the room itself. Ethan nodded once. Yes. Rick scoffed loudly. Of course you can. Ethan removed his jacket slowly and laid it across the workbench beside the old red toolbox. Claire noticed his white shirt beneath it carried faint oil, stains no amount of washing could fully erase. Rain clouds drifted outside the tall windows again, while cold wind rattled softly against the service bay doors. Ethan leaned beneath the hood and worked quickly now. Not rushed. Precise. Like a concert pianist returning to familiar keys after years away. The garage watched in complete silence except for the soft metallic clicks of his tools. Claire stood beside him holding the flashlight without him asking. Their movements began falling into quiet rhythm together. Wrench. Light. Adjustment. Breath. Somewhere overhead, fluorescent lights hummed faintly while the smell of gasoline and rain mixed through the cold air. Rick checked his watch repeatedly, growing more irritated every second. Ethan stayed calm. Then Ethan paused suddenly. Claire. Yes. The tape. She pulled the cassette carefully from her coat pocket. Ethan wiped one hand clean with the faded rag before taking it gently. Your father probably recorded this believing someday the car would run again, he said quietly. He deserves to be heard the right way. Claire felt tears burn behind her eyes again. Ethan slid the cassette carefully into the restored deck beneath the dashboard. Then he stepped back from the hood and nodded toward the driver's seat. Try now. Claire inhaled slowly and turned the key. For one heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the Shelby roared to life with deep, thunderous power that rolled across the garage floor stronger than before. Several investors jumped slightly in surprise. One mechanic actually dropped his phone. The engine settled into a smooth rumble while the cassette player clicked softly. Static crackled through the speakers. Then a warm, older voice filled the garage. "Hey, sweetheart, if you are hearing this, it means you finally got the old Mustang running again." Claire covered her mouth instantly. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Her father's voice continued softly through the speakers, wrapped in static and time. "I know life gets heavy sometimes, but do not let success turn your heart hard. The people who matter most are usually the quiet ones standing in the corner when everybody else stops looking." Claire broke into tears silently behind the wheel while the entire garage stood frozen beneath the fluorescent lights. Ethan lowered his eyes quietly. Rick said nothing at all, and for the first time since the morning began, nobody in the room could remember who the janitor was supposed to be. The recording ended in soft static, but nobody inside Dalton Restoration Auto moved for several long seconds afterward. Claire Whitmore sat behind the wheel of the Mustang with tears running silently down her face, while her father's final words seemed to linger beneath the fluorescent lights like something sacred. The engine rumbled smoothly now, deep and alive, vibrating gently through the concrete floor beneath everyone's feet. Around the garage, the investors stood completely silent. Phones lowered. Coffee forgotten. Even the younger mechanics who laughed the night before stared at Ethan Hayes differently now, almost carefully, like they had suddenly realized they were standing near something they did not fully understand. Ethan closed the hood quietly and stepped back toward his old red toolbox. No victory speech. No smug expression. Just the same calm man in oil-stained clothes trying to put his tools away before attention settled on him too long. Claire stepped slowly out of the Mustang, clutching the cassette tape against her chest. Her eyes found Rick Dalton first. "You knew," she said softly. Rick stiffened immediately. "Claire, listen, you knew the car could be restored." Her voice stayed calm, but somehow that made the words hit harder. One investor frowned toward Rick. Another glanced uneasily at the loosened fuel line still hanging near the engine bay. Rick forced a laugh that sounded hollow now. "Everybody makes mistakes." Ethan quietly snapped the final latch shut on his toolbox. "That was not a mistake," he said softly. The room fell silent again. Rick opened his mouth to argue, then stopped when several investors stepped farther away from him instead of closer. Claire looked toward Ethan slowly. "Why did you stay quiet?" Ethan shrugged lightly. People usually reveal themselves faster when nobody interrupts them. One of the investors approached Ethan carefully. "Mr. Hayes, is it true you worked with the National Restoration Institute?" Ethan looked uncomfortable already. "A long time ago. Your aircraft rebuilds are still studied in restoration programs." Ethan lowered his eyes briefly. "That was another life." Claire stared at him in disbelief. "You rebuilt history for museums, and now you mop floors?" Ethan gave the faintest smile. "Floors are easier." Claire shook her head slowly, emotion rising in her voice again. "No, floors are quieter." Ethan looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time since they met, something softer passed silently between them beneath the cold fluorescent lights and smell of rain-soaked asphalt drifting through the open garage doors. Outside, weak sunlight finally pushed through the clouds, reflecting softly across the Mustang's restored chrome. One investor cleared his throat. "Ms. Whitmore, if you are still searching for someone to lead the restoration division at Whitmore Automotive," he glanced toward Ethan respectfully, "I think your answer is standing right there." Claire smiled through tears and turned fully toward Ethan. "Come work for me." Ethan almost laughed quietly under his breath. "You cannot afford me." Several investors chuckled softly, surprised by the dry humor. Claire folded her arms gently. "Try me." Ethan rested one hand on the toolbox handle while the garage waited for his answer. Then he looked toward the Mustang instead of the money, the investors, or the opportunity standing in front of him. "I already have a job," he said quietly. Claire frowned slightly. "Mopping floors." Ethan shook his head once. "Raising my daughter." Silence settled warmly across the room after that. Not awkward silence. Respectful silence. The kind people fall into when they suddenly realize what real success actually looks like. Claire stepped closer and handed him the cassette tape carefully. "Then at least let me thank you properly." Ethan accepted the tape gently before handing it back. "Keep it," he said softly. "Some things belong with family." Outside the garage, the clouds finally broke apart completely. Sunlight spilled across the wet Oregon streets while the old Mustang engine purred steadily beside them like a memory finally allowed to come home. And standing there beneath the fading fluorescent lights, Claire Whitmore realized the shop had been wrong from the very beginning. The car was never beyond repair. Neither was she.